Welcome to the Cowboy Up Podcast, where talk is all about the West. This episode is brought to you by White Stallion Ranch and produced by Cowboy Spirit USA. Ever imagine what it would be like to live off the grid? Journalist Ted Conover decided to give this way of life a try. One of the outcomes? A new book titled Cheap Land, Colorado. Ted chats with Russell and Alan about the people, challenges, and lessons learned during his time as an off-gridder.
Well, Alan, morning.
Good morning. Again, happy to be here. I had a move in my life, and one of the constants is to come out here on Monday, so I'm really glad to be here today, more than usual.
Yeah, well, always good to see you. And, of course, you and I both grew up pretty rural. We've got a few acres here at White Stallion, and the other ranches, some of them are even bigger, but nothing's as big as where you grew up. That was what?
Well, on the home ranch, it was 160,000 acres. And then I had two other ranches, not in proximity, but two other ranches. So was ranching on about 250,000 acres at one point in time. But we had, in regard to our guest today, he's talking about off-gridders, and we had several on the old home ranch. We had several homesteaders which were off-gridders and were really tough, hard places to make a living. And ultimately in my life, all three of them just kind of faded out and picked up and left.
But different than off-gridders, so I'm not putting them in the same thing. But this ranch started out as a squatter's ranch, and it was somebody just built a ranch on unregulated, unmanaged federal land that ultimately became BLM and the Tailored Grazing Act. So anyway, our guest today knows something about doing this, living off the grid. Ted Conover is here. He's the author most recently of Cheap Land, Colorado, Off-Gridders at America's Edge. And it's been named best book of 2022 by the New Yorker and the Washington Post. That's a pretty big deal. He may be best known for New Jack guarding Sing Sing about his 10 months undercover as a New York State's correction officer. Boy, there's a podcast or two. New Jack won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His writings appeared in New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, National Geographic. He's a professor at and the former director of New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. And, of course, big deal to us, Ted's going to be presenting at the Tucson Festival of Books March 4th and 5th, the big event that we talk a lot about. It's really nice to have you with us, Ted.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to be out there.
You got a pretty day today.
Yeah, we'll welcome you here, and I think both of us will end up down there at the Festival of Books, so we'll look you up.
Sounds great.
What inspired you to go out to the San Luis Valley in Colorado and make your presence there?
Well, I'm from Colorado, but I'm from Denver, and that, as you know, is different from being from a rural place. I live in New York City now, and I imagine you can see that there might be times when a person here on the subway wishes they had a little more space around them. And I have felt that many times, and heard about this part of Colorado in the San Luis Valley in south central Colorado that it's about as big as New Jersey. It's a giant area with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on the east side and the San Juans on the left, and the southern end is actually in New Mexico, basically at Taos. But I heard that, starting in the last 15 or so years, people were living off grid in places where they hadn't before, and namely on these 5-acre lots, which were created in the 70s out of ranches. As you know, subdividers promise counties to make them more tax income by subdividing ranch land and selling them as lots. And that happened out there in the 70s before there was any regulation of subdivisions really in Colorado. And so these were just bare bones lots. The developers cut roads, and that's it. They didn't put in any utilities, no electric, water, sewer. Really, they put in some signs, which are mostly gone now, and sold them by mail for $30 down, $30 a month for 12 years. And the ads would say, "Own your Colorado ranch." And that's an appealing thought to a lot of people. And there weren't many ways to do it without a down payment. I mean, for $30. So they had some success selling these, but they had blowback too from the government. FTC said they were deceptive in, representing these lots could be lived on, because it's super hard to live on them. But fast forward to 5 years ago, I heard people were living on them, and I thought, what is that like? How do you manage on a shoestring out there in the middle of this sort of alpine desert? And who's there, and why are they there, and what's it like? And so, yeah, it's kind of the photo negative of my life in New York, but I like seeing things firsthand myself, and thought I'd go give it a try.
How long were you out there? You moved there? Is that when you went there to give it a try? You moved out there?
So at first I went for a couple weeks at a time, and volunteered for this group in Alamosa, the biggest town in the valley, which has a homeless shelter that would fill up with people from these off-grid places when the weather gets cold. And they thought, well, if we could give them some support, maybe they wouldn't need to become homeless like that. And I'd never even thought of becoming homeless from an off-grid situation. But it's pretty common that people run out of firewood, they run out of propane, or whatever, however they're staying warm. And anyway, it seemed like a good group and a good way to meet people, which is not easy because a lot of them aren't interested in being met, right? And so I started going out, and eventually bought a little camper trailer and rented a spot for it on the 5 acres of a family, mom and dad, 5 girls, homeschooled. And then, 3 years into it, I bought my own 5 acres just because I like being out there, which might sound kind of weird, but I just love the environment. I love being under that sky. I have some neighbors I really like. And so I don't live there. I'm a part-time resident, but I'm already counting the days till I can go back.
And so Ted, they're 5 acre parcels overall, or do they vary? And I guess the reason I ask, here in Arizona, we have a lot, and there's a lot of similar situations here in Arizona.
Yeah.
We were the land fraud capital of the U.S. in the 60s, I think it was. And so exactly what you've described is occurred. And some of those are real subdivisions in terms of how the state regulates them, and they're smaller pieces. But we also have a special, I don't know if the word would be exemption, but certain regulations where if you're 36 or bigger acres, and I think less than 160, then you can do a subdivision with very little regulation and much less infrastructure, creating what you've described. But are yours the small one? Those are mostly 5s?
No, they're 5 acre lots, but they were created in large numbers. In fact, in the county where I live, Castilla County, there are 45,000 5 acre lots, which is just this, it's a sort of very strange oversupply and maybe a few hundred people living on them. I don't know exactly what the state regulations prescribed along the lines of what you're talking about when they were created, but there may be 5 of these subdivisions, maybe 6 or 7 in the valley, have varying sizes, but they're really big. And it's interesting. I talked to one of the real estate guys who sold these lots when he was a young man, and he said he believed it would turn into some kind of town, some kind of community. He wasn't skeptical. He thought this is how it begins, right? And people will move and there will be a town here, but it just never happened. And so I think it's fair to say they are failed subdivisions. They sold, but they never really got built. And when things are built there, they're pretty bare bones. The county requires 600 square feet for a house or for any dwelling. And a lot of people bring in an RV and add on to it. Or, the structures are pretty basic, and the living is pretty rough.
And of course, living proof of, its failure as a result, basically, of being off the grid, right? I mean, there's not grid electricity. There's what is the water situation?
I was just going to ask that. That was my first question.
Exactly. So, you can drill a well. If you're on 5 acres, where I have the land I bought had a well on it, which is why I became interested, and also because it has a neighbor I really like who keeps an eye on things. But my well is 400 feet deep, and another neighbor of mine recently drilled one, and I think it cost him between $20,000 and $25,000.
Sure.
And you can only use that water inside your house. You can't water outside with it. So to get an agricultural well, you have to have at least 40 acres and go through a more involved permitting process. The people who live out there without wells get their water from a variety of sources. There are some springs, some properties with water where the owners don't mind people pumping it out of a little pond. There's you can buy water in some of the local towns, and then there are some sort of unofficial suppliers of water who probably shouldn't be doing it, but sell water to people with they call them totes, right? Big the plastic cubes with a sort of metal structure around them. And so people just and when I would go out for short periods of time, I'd buy 10 gallons of spring water from Walmart for 79 cents a piece and take showers in town, and that would do me for a week or 10 days, maybe longer with that much. So, we're not talking much comfort, but it's also a sort of, a small imprint. They're mostly not using much energy, just finding ways to get by.
What about power? Is there a power grid there, or what? Do they have generators?
Yeah, there's mostly solar panels. I think that's the technological change that made it possible for more people to move out there when the price of those went down. And I'd say everybody has at least some of them. There's 2 roads that have power lines running along them, and some of the properties there get power from the grid. But, I can see those towers from where I am, and I asked the county I guess it was the utility about getting it connected to my place, and it was over $20,000 to go about 250 yards, I think.
Wow.
So So they're not interested in expanding the grid, it seems. And, but I'd say, yeah, the greatest limiting factor to settlement is water. The Rio Grande goes by not far away at all. But it's illegal, to take water out of there. And people tend to respect that. So yeah, that is the hardest part, I think, is the water.
So we have a staff member who's been with us forever, and years and years ago, in Arizona, her parents went out and did, it was on 40s, because these are 40s typically. Yeah. And we're off the grid, prior to solar being available. So they were doing generators to the extent they had any power, and some battery stuff, and no wells, so they had to haul the water. But they did it. I mean, and they lived there, and they lived there in the winter. And it was, it's probably 6,000 feet elevation, so winters were really winter. And they did it. How many people that you know of do you sense aren't ending up in the homeless shelter? How many are making it?
I'm sure it's under 1,000, I would think. I didn't mention generators. Yes, everybody's got a generator. And batteries. A handful have wind turbines. But even with all those things, you spend a lot of energy providing yourself with the basic necessities, right? Driving here and there to get more wood.
Does everybody go to the grocery store for groceries, or any of them have a yard or a garden?
Yeah. There's a few greenhouse setups, but it's 7,000 to 8,000 feet elevation in the middle of the valley where these lots are, and so it gets cold. And you might grow some vegetables, but it's a short growing season, and people are always losing their seedlings when you get a frost at the end of June or something, and so it's. No, people going to town. The nearest grocery is probably a half hour from where I am.
Where's that?
Well, I could go either to Antonito or to San Luis, a very old town. From the Sangre de Cristo land grant days.
Talk to us just a bit about what your day is like when you're there. What do you get up in the morning, and what do you do?
I like to go outside and breathe the air for a while and think of how lucky I am to be there. I think about how much cloud cover there's going to be and how much I'm going to have to worry about my batteries holding out. I've got a lot of home improvements to do. My place came with an old mobile home from the early 80s is my guess, and it kind of had to be excavated, the inside that is, before I could live there. And there's plenty of projects to do, and but part of my mission was to meet my neighbors, to figure out who else is out there and why. So I always I tend to spend some time on my own, and then I go pay a visit to somebody, and, we might share a meal, or I might pick up something in town for them if I'm making the trip, because the gas money is a real expense for some of them. And I'm not officially a volunteer for that group anymore, but I'll still go by their food bank, or their, if somebody needs a coat, I can help out with that. But no, they're people who are, they want to be their own landlord, right? They don't want to pay those bills to a landlord or a utility or anybody else. So they're willing to put up with all the hardships, and try to get by on the very minimum. And it is possible to get a job and live out there, but it's hard because just if your car should break down and you're late, you could lose your job. And a lot of people don't have the greatest cars. And, sometimes the roads get impassable when the snow melts all at once and they just become mud pools. And, it's dicey. And, it's not for everybody.
What percent of them have a job and what percent just are out there living? Could you have any idea?
I don't know. Maybe 20% have a job, maybe a quarter.
Wow.
Something like that. Yeah.
Well, Ted, we're gonna, and I think, based on your book, what we've seen, a lot of it is about the people, and we want to come back to that, but we're going to take a break.
You bet.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to the Cowboy Up podcast. Your listenership and your recommendations have now made us one of the top programs in the Western genre. We now have thousands of listeners all around the world, and we're glad that your good word and your faithful attendance to the program makes that all possible. Now, we have a request. First of all, perhaps you know of somebody who would be a great guest to be a part of the program and kind of tell their story along with Russell and Alan. Well, why don't you recommend that person? Maybe give them a heads up that you're going to do it and let us know that they would be good for the radio and good for the program and good for everybody. And perhaps you are that person yourself and you've got something you'd like to share and you want to raise your hand and audition to be on the program, please do that. And right now, as we are going and growing, we would like you and your business and your organization to consider being one of our good sponsors. Of course, you get the shout out, you get the promotion, you get your story told to the thousands of our listeners, but you also know that you are not only building your business, you are actually building something that is really good. The Cowboy Up podcast, Cowboy Spirit USA, here, as we say, maybe to help save Western civilization by carrying on with the Western tradition. So we would welcome your application to sponsor some of the programs that we produce. So reach out to us at the Cowboy Up Podcast at gmail.com. The Cowboy Up Podcast at gmail.com. And why don't you join the show?
All right, so we left with the residents and a lot of your adventure, and I think it's fair to call it an adventure. Out there in the San Luis Valley is meeting the people. Tell us about some of them.
Yeah, so the fellow who helped me meet people is a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan named Matt Little, who grew up in West Virginia, big family, but suffered many setbacks. His house burned down, his wife passed away, and he Googled these 3 words, cheap land, Colorado, to find where he might live next. And that's why I use that as the title of my book. I just thought that sums it up. And it explains why a lot of people ended up there. He rented a U-Haul for his horse, not a horse trailer, but as he's all about counting pennies, he got do you call it a box truck with the rail? You know how they have the railings inside, and brought his horse with him, built a corral for his horse. There are feral horses out there which would come by and cause trouble sometimes. But he wanted to live in this place he'd always dreamed about. He had trouble making ends meet, so when he heard about this rural outreach job, he went for it. And he showed me how you drive up somebody's place. You try to size it up before you tap your horn. You see if there's smoke coming out of the chimney, if there's children's toys. In front, you see his thought is if there's an American flag, there's probably a firearm. He's very respectful. He'll stop on the road, tap his horn, and wait till somebody shows up, and he'll step outside the truck so they can see he's not some kind of gang banger or, something bad. He's just a nice guy who's checking in to see if he can offer any assistance. And he was my tutor, and he told me there's a lot of vets out there, and also people with different people who are on disability who can afford to live out there and not have a job. People like the family I stayed with, the Grubers, wanted to homeschool their kids. The parents have various medical problems, but they're a happy family, and I learned a lot. I basically am in the position of not knowing basic things I need to know, like how am I going to stay warm in this camper trailer when it starts getting cold, and what's an inverter, what's a marine battery, what's a golf cart battery, what are all these things that you guys have, and how do I use them? And so figuring that out makes a pretty good story.
What would you like readers to take away from this book? It's a bestseller and doing real well. What do you want your readers to know or feel?
So to me, this is a story about how it's still possible in this country to sort of live that frontier story, right? Of heading west like Matt did, finding land, building a place, starting a new life. There's a old American story that follows that outline. It's, and I'm glad that option exists for people. At the same time, I don't need to tell you, it's rough, and it's not often you're going to find additional opportunities in a sort of low population, low income area like that, right? There aren't a lot of jobs. You're going to have to make ends meet however you can. And, but there's a real grit and determination that I admire in the people I meet. There's at the same time, I'll be candid, there's a lot of big city problems I recognize, from addictions to people being in unhealthy relationships, and you see it all, but it's a wide variety of people, most of whom I think you could connect with. There's a lot of just beautiful humanity out there trying to get by in a rugged landscape.
How big an influence is marijuana there? Is that why people are there? Is that how they make a living? Is it typical to have every house you drive up to have a marijuana plot?
So it's funny, as Matt was driving me around during my first weeks, he pointed out, he'd say, oh, there's a grow, and there's a grow. And I thought he was saying grove, like Grove, like an orange, a citrus grove. But he was talking about a marijuana grow, meaning a place where you grow your marijuana. And most people do that behind some sort of fence or, screen, so that it's not visible from the road. You don't want to advertise how many plants you've got. But I'd say lots of people have those. It's legal to have 12 of them. I guess it's mostly for personal use, but I think there's also some barter that goes on around having some weed. I met a guy who is a dishwasher at a local restaurant, and he was actually partly paid in marijuana, which I'd never heard of before. And then there's actually some, out there in the mix, there's some actual farmers and ranchers with a couple of pivots and crops and livestock, but they're a sort of parallel culture, right? There's real agriculture in the valley, but those folks are mostly, they've been there longer and they're well established and live more normal American lives.
The two cultures don't cross mix much. Is that what I think I'm hearing?
Not a whole lot. There's some real skepticism from the more settled folks about the new arrivals and their moral character and their, I'd say, it's fair that they don't mix a lot, but there are many exceptions. The second oldest girl of the family I stayed with got a job on a nearby ranch when she turned 18, and she's been one of their best employees ever, and she loves working with horses, and they're grateful when they can find a good worker like that who who knows the work will be hard.
But
and
would you agree that this is kind of the term age old is wrong, but this is an historic Western challenge that I think of the Eatons, which is the first dude ranch, acknowledged to be the first dude ranch, and they started in the Dakota Territory with what they called the Custer Trail Ranch, and they ended up leaving that area and going to where they are now, Wolf, Wyoming. And this was late 1800s, right at the turn of the century, actually. Mm-hmm. And they had, I think they were calling them, it was a derogatory term. I think it was dirt farmers. I don't remember and it was folks coming in and doing homesteading and small properties, and really the ranchers were not fans. And obviously they had different investments and different levels of assets, and in that case, it drove the Eatons away. But I think that story's been told thousands of times. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I do. And I think when I see an old log cabin out there, I'll think that, in a lot of ways, that was the predecessor of the old wrecked RV you might see today, right? It's a person with very few means, setting out into the unknown, somewhat dangerous, empty land to try to make something of it and make a life. And it often, maybe even usually, doesn't work out. I think if you have, real limited resources, it's not hard to fail at this. And in fact, my neighbors often say they try not to get to know new arrivals until they've lasted at least one winter, because otherwise, you're going to be asked to help them make it through the winter, and that's a big ask sometimes. So no, I do think this has been a feature of the settlement of these lands for a long, long time. It just looks different now.
Right. That's kind of how I feel about it. And I feel like I have a pretty good sense of this, just because similar situations exist in Arizona. A little easier if you're not at 7,000 or 8,000 feet. It might be easier about 4,000, 5,000 elevation. Where if somebody gets really sick, where's the nearest hospital for?
Yeah, so there's a clinic about 45 minutes away, and do they call it an ER there? I guess they do. If I got bit by a rattlesnake or otherwise hurt, that's where I would go. And often, though, if it's anything serious, they transfer you, and the transfer is often to a place like Colorado Springs, which is a couple hours away. And Frank Gruber, the dad of this family I stayed with, had a neuropathy in his leg that they realized was because he wasn't getting circulation there. This little clinic saw him 3 times, and he just kept coming back. The 4th time, he ended up being flown in a helicopter to Denver because they were afraid he was going to die and or lose his leg and die. Anyway, he survived, and but the medical care is not what you'd expect in a more built up area. It's pretty sparse.
What do you foresee? How do you want to have that place look in 10 years? You know, your wishes or your projections.
That's such an interesting question. So, you know, it's a poor county. They have a limited budget. My taxes are $49 a year, and that's pretty typical. And it doesn't pay for much more than grading of the roads occasionally, and I guess it pays for schools for the families that have kids. But like, there's no trash collection out there. All the services are pretty bare bones. Law enforcement takes a long time to arrive. And then for their part, the prairie people are often resentful of the county when it tries to enforce zoning codes or, they have this idea that they just want to be left alone. What I would love is to see, people would kill me if they heard me say this, maybe slightly higher taxes and some kind of way of bringing your garbage to a transfer station, something that doesn't leave so much junk out on this beautiful landscape.
Do you see a lot of that when you drive around? Do you see piles of junk?
You see abandoned places, which, you know, don't look so good after a while. And you see, you've heard of earth ships, right? These eco houses developed in New Mexico, and they use, old tires and such. This idea sort of caught on that you could build with old tires, and there's these piles of them around that are just an eyesore, and it would be, there's got to be some more effective arrangement by which, the homesteaders could get support, and in exchange be more willing to go by the rules and have it all be a bit less seat of the pants than it sometimes is.
In the people living there resenting the government, all that is a lot of that financial, that they don't want the government to raise their taxes, or is it just their mindset that they don't want anything to do with the government? Can you speak to that for a minute?
So I'd say it's both. I'd say, people are resentful when they hear they have to pay a fee to connect their dwelling to the road with a driveway. There's a driveway fee that really rankles people. But then just overall, I think there's a resistance to government. I'd say folks are libertarian more than anything else. They just, want to be left alone. And I think often that's a good thing. But then when you need that ambulance, or you need the deputy, or you need
the trash picked up.
The trash, that's kind of, it's not going to pick itself up. And So we've had some interesting conversations. I am, of course, I'm sort of the stand-in for all the Democrats people hear about on TV, coming from a big city, and I'm a journalist, I'm a professor, I'm all these things people don't like, and it's the beginning of a lot of good conversations where we start where they can't believe they're in a room with somebody like me, and it ends up in a place where, well, we're going through many things in a parallel way, and here's an example. Everybody's running their generators. I say, in a town, we pay a company, and the company gives us electricity, and we don't all have to run our generators, and it's quieter, and the air is cleaner. And I think overall it's probably cheaper. But I have yet to find anyone who agrees with me that that's a good idea.
So I think it's interesting. So you said that your friend said that when he drives up and sees the U.S. flag, that's code in his mind for likely there's a firearm. And I think of a friend of mine who moved into a place in North Carolina and put a U.S. flag up shortly after they moved in. And the first visitor came over and said, really unhappy to see you here. You got this U.S. flag. Clearly, this was during Trump's presidency. So clearly you're a Trumper, and we're really offended. And the next week, somebody came over and said, oh, great to see a Trumper in the neighborhood. And I thought, wow, U.S. flag means you're for or not for? I just was shocked.
Yeah.
So in that area, I would think most people have a gun, because it sounds like a lot of people are a bit paranoid. And it seems like there's a libertarian streak, and I sure get that. I mean, I if you're going to go do this, the anti-government, or at least concern about government and overreach and all that is the best friend of libertarianism. Is that the one common thread, or are these people? Are you going to have hard left, hard right? Is it contentious there?
Do they even vote?
Oh, that's a good question.
What was the second question?
Do they even vote?
Yeah, I don't think most probably vote. I'd say if they had, more would have voted for Trump. I don't know very many that would have voted for Joe. But I don't. There's almost nobody on the left, at least out on the prairie, or in the towns around the valley, which are, closer to streams and trees and, which are considered more desirable. There are definitely all kinds of voters, but out there on the prairie, yeah, I'd say they're mostly leaning right, but in various ways, and yeah, sure. I think without a lot of voting, yeah.
So if a good-hearted soul got a garbage truck and started running around there for free saying, I'm driving up and down the road, I'll pick up your garbage, would they be glad? Would they go out and help him load the garbage, or would they say, get off my property?
That's a great question.
I'd say if you stayed on the road, they'd be happy to see you. And I think a parallel question is, if you lived out there and you heard the government was providing stimulus payments in the hundreds and thousands of dollars, would you be willing to accept one, even if you don't think they're a good thing? And I have seen the answer with my own eyes.
And the answer is
yes, of course. You'd be a fool not to take that payment.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'll bet. All right. Here's the name of the book, of course, says Cheap Land, Colorado. How cheap is it? If somebody today wants to be your neighbor, what can they get in there for?
$4,000, $5,000, $6,000 will buy you 5 acres.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's quite cheap. But again, it seems cheaper. It seems really cheap until you realize that, well, what are you going to do with it? Are you just going to, if you build something there and you don't occupy it year round, it's going to be vulnerable to, to being tampered with, or things might go missing. And then if you're just thinking of camping there, it's the same kind of question. Are you going to leave anything behind? You actually have to get a permit to camp more than 2 weeks on your land out there now. They don't enforce it much lately, but when I got there, they did, and it had caused a big problems between the county and
I'll bet it did.
The prairie people. Some of them were given 10 days to put in a septic system or face fines of $100 a day. And, some of them had lived out there many years just with an outhouse, and one old hermit and his outhouse. You kind of think, well, let's give the guy a little time. But they took up a very hard line, and there was ill will, and it attracted some sort of radical people from outside, these constitutional sheriffs and folks who, don't believe in the legitimacy of the government. And they came and radicalized some local people. It's all calmed down now, but things got a little spooky for a while.
Well, if you're sort of leaning toward not being a big fan of government, they make you get a permit to stay on your own land for over 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That's today's version of the stamp tax. That ain't gonna make you happy.
Is there any interplay between the ranchers out there and the what would you call them? They're not squatters.
They're off-gridders.
The off-gridders, yeah.
Yeah. Well, like I said, this girl from the family is an employee of a ranch. It's a horse ranch. I'd say, an able-bodied person who wanted to work, there's a rancher out there who will hire you in various agricultural operations. Another of my neighbors drove a truck for a carrot producer. They grow a ton of potatoes. Another one of my neighbors drives a truck that follows a potato harvesting machine for 6 weeks a year and makes enough money to subsist on for most of the rest of the year. So I'd say there is interplay, but it's kind of haves and have-nots, right? If you're a prairie person, you don't have much, and their need for labor is mostly seasonal, and you do see that. You do see some of that.
What kind of a response have you gotten to your book? It's a praised book, and are people buying it? And what response back do you get from letters and comments?
I'd say it's been good. I won't lie and say it's universally good. There's it's often you find you've offended somebody for reasons that never even occurred to you. But by and by, I think people appreciate that I didn't just stop in and do some interviews and head back east and write an article about it. I really, I wanted to understand it in a sort of more personal way and get to know actual people instead of just, symbols of something. And so, I wish the book weren't $30, but there'll be a paperback and there's Kindle versions. And
how many days a year, roughly, are you out there on that land?
So let me think. Typically, I'd say about third of the year up until this year when it's been less. My last time was in November, and the publication of the book means I have to go places like Tucson and
oh my God.
Tucson in March is okay.
It's okay, right?
Yeah,
I'm looking
Tucson
forward
in
to
March
it.
is going to be good. Well, back to Alan's question. I think if you don't offend somebody today, you haven't done anything. I mean, everybody's so
right.
easily and quickly offended, and that seems to be the biggest. What is it? It's the biggest crime in America today is to offend somebody, and it just seems like we've gone way long, and we got to have you back, talk about New York prisons and rodeos and all this other stuff you've done. But how do the neighbors like the book? Have they read it? Have they commented?
Yeah, they seem to appreciate it. PBS, Rocky Mountain PBS, just did a special, and they interviewed a bunch of my neighbors, some of whom told embarrassing stories about me, and seemed to. I think that's another sort of Western tradition, right? You have to educate the dude, and put him in his place. But no, it's been mostly good. I didn't want to scorch any earth with this book. I wanted to start a dialogue and see if I could get to know people who don't live like me, and vice versa. And all in all, I've been really glad about it. And this is the funny thing, I work in Sing Sing for almost a year, and I was so happy to be done with that job. That is the worst. But this one, I'm not ready to be done. I'm going to I've already planned my next 3 trips out there, and I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but my fence needs a little work, and I'll start there, I guess.
Well, Ted, you've got, and we went over it at the beginning, and there's other books and information. Is there a one-stop shop they can learn more about you?
I've got a website called tedconover.com.
Perfect.
And it's even got a link to an old video made from the land sale era.
Okay.
At tedconover.com. And the book is called Cheap Land, Colorado. And I'm going to look for you guys in Tucson in a couple weeks.
Yeah, March 4th and 5th. And you're going to be, and everybody's heard us talk about it, but at the University of Arizona, one of the biggest book festivals in the country, March 4th and 5th. Ted Conover, TEDCONOVER.com. And what's the name of the PBS video that was recently done?
Yeah, it's called Cheap Land.
So, coincidentally, they can remember Cheap Land, Colorado, and they're in business with you. Thank you very, very much.
Alan and Russell, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks, Ted.
Yeah, you got us in trouble with Lynn. We went way over, so thank you.
Anytime.
And once again, the storytelling just goes and goes and finally has to come to an end. And many times we just like to keep on going and hear more. So we thank you for being, as we say, a faithful listener and supporter of the Cowboy Up Podcast. And to let you know that the Cowboy Up Podcast comes to you right from one of the historic ranches in the United States, the historic White Stallion Ranch in Tucson, Arizona. The place, the Dude Ranch place, a true experience, maybe for a couple on a honeymoon, maybe for a family that needs a new adventure, maybe for a business that wants to actually have a business experience, a coaching, teaching program that is above average and very different. So why don't you let us know how we can help you? WhiteStallion.com, WhiteStallion.com.
I think, Alan, and I may have told you this story, but years ago, a governor of Wyoming spoke at our Dude Ranchers convention. His name was Friedenthal. And he jokingly said, looking out at us, I imagine there aren't a lot of Democrats out there. I'm one. He said, I think it's less a country of Republicans and Democrats. This is 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And much more a country of rural and urban. And he said that divide is becoming more and more stark. My language, not his, because it was a long time ago. And I think about, you like Trump, hate Trump. You've got this orange-haired, flamboyant New York City land developer who becomes a hero, or at least in this rural part of Colorado, a spokesman for them. He has very little in common with them. And yet I think almost that era exaggerated this divide between rural versus urban. And I don't see it changing. And I suspect those ranchers and those little, what do you call them, prairie people, probably have more in common in their viewpoints than they even know.
They're outnumbered 10,000 to 1 or 20,000 to 1, and that number is growing, I think. And so they are and will be even a smaller minority. And but yet they have their way of life and they have what they want, and they're entitled to that. And so my sympathy goes out to them just because they're such a small minority of the people, and have a hard time staking out their place. But they're out there doing it.
And maybe that's why they self-hermitize. I just made up a word.
Yeah.
They choose to go.
Yeah, their own way.
Hey, appreciate you sharing your time today. And Russell, it's okay if you guys went a little long. Ted's story is fascinating. Remember, if you're headed to the Tucson Festival of Books on March 4th and 5th, be sure to meet Ted Conover, as well as other authors who have been featured on the Cowboy Up podcast. And of course, the podcast would not be possible without the talented Stan Houston and his production team. Be sure to join us next week for some Western storytelling a la our own Russell True and Alan Day. Until then, I'm Lynn Weezy Sneed, reminding you to stand tall and ride safe.